Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the High Impact Roundtable on Scaling Up Minigrids, answering the question, how can the enabling environment drive investments? I'm Tom George, Managing Director of Africa Grant Advisors and the AMDA Advocacy Coordinator for Kenya and Tanzania. And this roundtable has been organized by us at AMDA and our great partners at Camco, the managers of REPP. Most of you know AMDA, but for those of you who don't, AMDA, which stands for the Africa Minigrid Developers Association, is an industry association created by private sector minigrid developers and operators, donors, and investors seeking to improve market conditions for minigrid companies. AMDA works to improve policy, regulation, and investment towards ending energy poverty by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. One major part of this work is collaborating with policymakers, regulators, the private sector, and other stakeholders to design and implement mini-grid sector regulations that can support scalable investments in the sector. And that brings us to today's roundtable. The theme of this discussion is scaling up mini-grids. How can the enabling environment drive investments? And the conversation will focus specifically on the current draft of Kenya's mini-grid regulations 2021. The roundtable will be split into 4 parts. First, our panelists will introduce themselves. Second, we'll have a limited roundtable with the panelists, moderated by myself, posing key questions about the regulations and getting input from their different perspectives. Third, we'll pose questions that we'll field from audience members to the panelists. And finally, we will finalize the poll that will be held in the second half of the roundtable, looking at key questions to take the pulse of all of you audience members and review the results of those poll questions together. So before we start, a few quick housekeeping notes. First, on questions. You should all be able to submit questions in the chat box of your Zoom application. If you do submit questions, please add your name and the organization that you represent to the question so that we know who they're coming from. And also note that any questions that are not answered due to time limitations will be answered in writing after the event, and any comments and feedback that we receive will be passed on to the regulator. The other housekeeping notes are on the poll. So the way the poll will work is we want to hold a poll on 3 key questions we want to ask attendees to take your pulse on some of the key issues surrounding the regulations. So you will see the poll questions displayed on your screen after the initial panelist roundtable, about halfway. Submit your votes to the poll questions whenever you want during the final half of the webinar. And you can also change your answers throughout the event. And we're going to take a final tally at the end of the event. Okay, super. So let's proceed. Allow me to introduce everyone to our fantastic panelists and let me have them introduce themselves and their organizations in a bit more detail. So today, representing Kenya's regulator of the energy sector, we have Mr. Nixon Bukachi, the Senior Renewable Energy Officer at the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. Representing the investor's perspective, we have Yeva Indrunaite, Policy and Partnerships Manager at Camco Clean Energy, the manager of the Renewable Energy Performance Platform, REPP. And finally, we have Vivian Vindorino, founder and managing director of Kudura Power East Africa Limited, giving us the developer's perspective. Could I ask you each, maybe starting with you, Nixon, to just give brief intros to yourselves and your organizations?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, participants, for joining. My name is Nixon Bukachi, as Tom has already said. I work for the Energy Petroleum Regulatory Authority. So the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority is the Kenya energy sector regulator. We are in charge of both technical and economic regulation of energy and petroleum in the country, where we look at the entire value chain from clean fuels to other fossil fuels, depending on the sector. But myself, I'm actively involved in the renewable energy subsector, looking at mini grids as one of the areas, and also aspects to do with other forms of renewable energy projects in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Nixon. Yeva, can you go next?
Sure, thank you. So I think you have already introduced me, but I am the Policy and Partnerships Manager at Camco. Camco Clean Energy is the manager, as mentioned, of the Renewable Energy Performance Platform. For those not familiar with REPP, REPP is a facility financed by UK government's climate finance through Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. The purpose and aim of REPP is to support small to medium scale renewable energy development across sub-Saharan Africa. We have been operating in the mini-grid space since around 2016, I would say. And we have quite a large mini-grid portfolio, starting with the first investment in Kenya being with PowerHive, and today also supporting PowerGen, which also operates in Kenya. So we have been in this market for a while and very excited to see it develop. As part of REPP's mandate, we also always aim to contribute to the development of the enabling environment. And this is where, in my role as the policy manager, I have been trying to inform effectively the development of the mini-grid regulations in Kenya over the last 6 months or so in great collaboration with EPRA and with AMDA. I'm very excited to speak today.
Thanks, Yeva. Viv, if you can go.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Vivian Vindorino. I am founder and managing director of Kuduro Power East Africa. We currently are serving 15 mini-grids, around 3,500 customers in Busia County. We are part of the RV Sol Group, of which I'm founder also, and developing projects in Mozambique and Madagascar, in addition to obviously scaling up in Kenya. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this discussion. It should be some fun.
Super. Thanks, Viv. Thanks all. All right, let's dive into the first half of the discussion today. And that will be some questions posed by me to the various panelists, probably spark some discussion, and I hope it will also spark some maybe follow-up questions from you attendees, which you can feel free to message at any time in the chat or the Q&A box in the Zoom platform. Let me start with a question for you, Nixon. Why did EPRA see a need to develop new regulations for the mini-grid sector?
Thank you. I think over the years, we have seen the sector develop. Since 2015, I remember that's the time we had the first mini-grid in the country, private mini-grid, that is, which was developed by PowerHive. In parts of Kisii, where they've been operating over a period of time. During that time, we didn't have a regulatory framework that is focusing on specifically main grids, and we are using the Energy Act then of 2006 and electricity licensing regulations. But as all of us would know, most of these acts and regulations were focusing towards the big projects, mostly IPPs, and the big companies that are involved in the generation and transmission of electricity. So in this case, we saw the need that we should have kind of a framework that would encourage development of mini-grids. And we started with developing some internal guidelines that we have been using since 2018. But we think then it's important that we have a regulation, because then it makes it easier to enforce some of the provisions that are provided for in those documents. Because for example, if there is an issue of enforcing quality, or you want to discuss aspects to do with tariff, it's difficult to use a document that has not gone through public participation and accepted by stakeholders as a framework to be able to guide the sector. So it's through this that we have been working very closely since 2017 with the sector players to come up with the regulations that we are talking about today in terms of the draft that we have today. And we think that once we are concluded with the process, we'll have a framework that will be able to attract more funding into the mini-grid subsector, and also look at the end consumer in terms of quality of supply, quality of service, and also make sure that we have a framework that harmonizes between projects that are being done by government and also the projects that are being supported by private sector, so that we don't have conflicting projects in the same regions and the likes. And lastly, maybe have a highlight on how we are able to address aspects to do with grid arrival, which are important. So that's why we have come up with this framework that we are proposing at this particular time. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Nixon. Well noted. Let me move to a question for Viv from the developer's perspective. Having developed and now being operating mini grids under the kind of current or soon to be former regulatory framework and comparing it with these new regulations, do you feel that the new draft regulations are an improvement to the existing and soon to be old regulatory framework?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, since we commissioned our first grid in late 2011, a community managed grid in Western Kenya, the regulation has been consistently evolving. In the past, this was informal. It required simple registration with EPRA and the Ministry of Energy providing import exemptions or recommendations, therefore, to the Treasury. I think the regulation in its current form kind of leaps forward a lot. It represents the most holistic approach, I think, on the continent currently to formalizing mini grids, as a scalable and viable least cost approach for off-grid areas. I think there still are some issues to resolve, but it does go a long way to supporting developers, operators like ourselves, to providing infrastructure investors the peace of mind they need to really scale up this business and accelerate energy access goals, in particular in this case for Kenya, but I think potentially a really good example for other countries in the continent also.
Great. Thank you, Viv. We want to dive into some details, some technical details of the regulations, and not shy away from some deeper questions about questions investors may have on the bankability of the regulations and the market in general. Let me move to a question to you, Yeva. Something that has been talked a lot about in the process of the regulations being developed is the fact that a mini grid developer will only be granted a license on constructing their mini grid, testing the mini grid, and then commissioning the generation plant and distribution infrastructure that can serve at least 30% of the site's target customers. Thanks to Nixon and the EPRA team, a lot of assurances have been built into the current regulations so that developers and their investors know that license will be issued if the 30% kind of target is met and commissioning is completed. But Yeva, what's your view as an investor about the bankability of that regulation?
Thanks, Tom, for the question. I think you have actually highlighted quite a lot of detail of what I would have probably tried to bring forth in the introduction of the question. One of the points that I think this is one of the most important and maybe slightly contentious points in the regulations. From the first look, this is definitely unusual for looking from, let's say, a project finance perspective, which is increasingly used in mini-grid financing, to have the license in this case being issued only after construction has begun and reached quite a considerable level. I should, yes, reiterate that following our feedback, in fact, EPRA has listened to this and we have come into an arrangement, well, not an arrangement, but so the current provision basically is that a lot of the requirements that would have been assessed at the license application stage, they would have been already assessed as part of the tariff application. I should note that also in the first draft, there were more sort of multiple stages envisaged that has now been simplified. So that's definitely a great improvement. I would say that, being very honest, and I think my camera is failing me, but I do still feel that there could have been other ways of achieving what I believe EPRA wanted to achieve with this provision, which, and Nixon, please feel free to come in, but I think largely it is the risk of the mini grids not being developed after the license is issued. So I think it could have been dealt with perhaps in other ways, as for example limiting, including clauses in the license that perhaps its validity would be expiring in a certain period of time if the mini grid is not at least partially constructed. So I think that there are maybe other ways in which investors could have been more reassured in the current draft, and I think we have provided through AMDA some further feedback on how to sort of tighten this clause. I think, if it stays the way it is, then it's definitely important to have as much reassurance as possible that the license will indeed be issued. So in fact, exactly as EPRA is looking at it, to have as much as possible assessed prior to the, to having the construction begin, and then sort of this being effectively, well, I can't say a formality, but as much reassurance, as I said, given before the construction has to begin. But perhaps Nixon would actually like to come in and expand on what I've mentioned.
No, I think you have highlighted all that you could have said, but basically, as you have mentioned, one of the things that we are looking at is having a mechanism where we would be able to push, I would say, if you'd allow me to use that word, investors to invest as soon as possible once we give them the approval in terms of the tariff approval. And that's why I think we have tried to, we have made that proposal to have the license issued after the tariff has been approved, but then limited it within a period of 1 year. Basically because we don't have a provision in the main law that allows us to give a temporary license, for instance. That's one of the limitations that we're being faced with. But also I think maybe the only challenge that we might have, maybe issuing a license before, then the investor might be required to meet most of the obligations before they start construction, which in a way could also disadvantage investment in those mini-grid sectors. So it's an area that we are still looking at. And I think before we finalize on the process, we should be able to have a concrete a solution that we think will give us comfort as a regulator, give the local communities that are being served comfort, and also, of course, most importantly, comfort to the financiers of the projects that we have. So any recommendations along those lines are still welcome until when we finalize the process. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Nixon. Thank you, Yeva. Sorry to steal some of the answer from you, Yeva, during the actual question. All right, in the same vein of more of technical questions, and we really want to query the details of the regulations in this webinar and not sugarcoat it, but look at the risks and look at maybe some of the challenges. I have a question for you, Viv. As a developer, how do you feel about the regulations approach to compensation or interconnection procedures should the main grid arrive at a mini grid site? Viv, you're on mute. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think there's actually two aspects to that question. The one aspect is, what happens when the grid arrives in terms of interconnection, whatever the case may be. The other aspect is more related to encroachment on existing sites. And I'd like to address the first one first, maybe, if I may. And this is one of the issues that I alluded to previously with the current regulation. I think there still needs to be some thought put into what a world looks like, 10, 15 years after a site is licensed, because I don't think the regulation currently speaks to that specifically. As the number of mini grids scale across the country, we are seeing interventions by the national utility to stake territory in a relatively simplistic form that doesn't consider underserved communities and the broader negative impact of those interventions on rural electrification rates. We as a developer operator are absolutely 100% focused on achieving 100% connectivity in every single site that we have licensed. That requires us to be very smart about how we apply subsidies to customers within those sites, because I think this business, when you focus on the high income customers and the actual businesses within the communities and maybe public institutions, is relatively straightforward. But when you try and connect the 60 or 65% of the communities that are considered base of the pyramid, it becomes a lot more complicated. And of course, we have seen recently in the press that the utility has published information that shows that when they connect these rural communities, where a large part of the community are in fact classically not bankable, that it actually costs them more money than they make, and that's not efficient. So that's the first part. I think in terms of the second part, Yeva had mentioned early on that more and more we're starting to see IPP type regulation being applied to mini grids as investors in the sector across the continent start to realize that ultimately, this is an infrastructure investment. It requires a different kind of scale. It requires a different kind of pathway to scale up. but ultimately at sufficient scale, it is an infrastructure investment. And I think we need to take from the lessons that have been learned in the IPP sector from the point of view of grid connection. And then, of course, the third aspect there is, what is the exit ultimately for a developer operator? And my fear there, to tell you quite personally, my personal motivation in this business is very much aligned to energy access and the fundamentals thereof. My fear is that, when you integrate with a grid or you even sell the assets to a national utility that doesn't regard those customers as their primary focus, that doesn't have the social agenda that we have as a company to bring life-changing access to those customers, that ultimately they just become one of millions of customers in the country, and the quality of service goes down. So I think maybe I've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think that fundamentally there is some thought that needs to be put into what does the world look like after a license has been issued, and what are the exit mechanisms there that ensure that ultimately the customers maintain the same quality of service that companies like ourselves have provided to them over the years. I hope I've answered your question.
You have. Thanks, Viv. Yeva, I saw you come off mute. Do you want to add to that?
Maybe, although I'm not sure what your next question will be, so I don't want to jump ahead too much. I do think that this question is very much linked to the planning question, which I hope we'll touch upon as well. But just in terms of, again, for those who have not, are maybe too busy to have had a look before this webinar at the regulations. So I would note that from the first draft, the options available to the mini-grid developers have been extended. So at the moment, I think in terms of what the options are, just from the technical perspective, they do cover various possibilities. I think when it comes to the actual compensation, the mechanisms for that, from what I understand, are yet to be developed. And that includes actually the tariff calculation tools that are now being circulated, I believe, for some sectoral stakeholders for their consultation. So these are definitely very critical elements that we will be looking at. I think it will be important to ensure that there is a clear depreciation schedule, that decommissioning costs are potentially calculated in that, and then I think looking at the process, what's interesting is that in my personal view, is that the regulations already envisaged that the compensation in this case would be paid by the Rural Electrification and the Renewable Energy Corporation, which is, I think quite an interesting aspect. But still, independent arbitration in these cases can be an important element that financiers will be looking at. So I think there are, when it comes to compensation, there are still a number of questions that will have to be answered. And I hope that we will get clarity on those in the near future.
Thank you, Eva. Super. My next question was a bit of another detail question, something on a slightly different topic, but you did just touch on it a little bit, Yeva. So let me just move to this so we can kind of canvas some of the key topics here still in the first half of the webinar. It's a question for you, Nixon. We and developers and the stakeholder community have recently received the updated tariff calculation tool. We wanted to understand from you, what will EPRA's process for updating or revising the tariff application tool be in the coming years as these regulations are implemented? Is there a process for taking into account further input from developers and investors on the tariff calculation methodology?
Thank you, Tom. I think for a start, the reason why we shared the tool is because we want to get feedback from the people who are going to use it, because basically you are the users of the tool, which is very important. And we think once we go through this process in this cycle, we might be able to utilize the tool for some time. And where we want to update, definitely we'll also still do the same process, where we'll circulate with the key developers, who in this case will be the developers most of the time. Because the way we are looking at it, we could have presented, for example, that during the public participation, but then we may not have gotten quite concrete feedback because it needs some specialized education. But what will happen if you want to change, not the fundamental structure of the model, then in this case, we'll have to engage the stakeholders who are mostly the developers, who are the users of this model, before we are able to start applying it for subsequent tariff applications. So I think that's what I foresee in future, but we believe if we get sufficient feedback in this cycle, then we could have a tool that you're able to use for quite some time, because the previous one that we had, I think, was developed around 2017, 2018. So I've been able to use it for the last 2 to 3 years. But then after that, maybe going forward, we foresee that if we want to update any aspect in terms of the key structure, then we'll have to still engage the same stakeholders before we're able to update. And the good thing that I would want to mention, I think AMDA has done quite a good job in terms of being able to bring the stakeholders on the table, the key stakeholders who are involved in the development of mini grids. We also have the people who have expressed interest to develop mini grids. We will still have to get this tool to give comments on the same. And we think going forward, it will be more easier to reach out to some of these players as opposed to before, where you could not know who is interested in the sector, who are the financiers. But at least this process has assisted us to be able to come up with a clean and good database that you can usually use to contact them and be able to get feedback on the same before we progress with the use.
Super. Thank you, Nixon. That's clear. I have another question for you, Viv, which is, as a developer, how has your experience in capital raising been? And are your existing investors wary of the draft regulations, or do you think investors have an appetite to bank the current draft regulations?
Thanks, Tom. I wouldn't say they are wary. I think, you know, the investors that we've been speaking to, those that we've closed with and those that we've spoken to previously, are all aware that the regulations are developing and that there's a strong interest on the part of the government to move forward with a framework that will see, you know, some scale achieved within the sector and accelerated electricity access goals. I think we've been fortunate in that, bar the timing and you know, some lack of transparency in terms of getting approvals, that our sites are compliant. And I guess from an investor perspective, that provides a level of confidence that as you grow and scale, that your ability to continue to get those approvals is relatively straightforward. We did last year, end of 19, we did lose one major IPP investor on the back of concerns about the regulatory framework. And they were coming from a place of being familiar with, you know, IPP projects across the continent. And they just felt that the mini grid regulation was not, you know, nowhere close enough to providing the level of confidence that they would have in an IPP project. The flip side of that is, over the last 4 years, we have brought on, you know, 4 new investors, 3 of them with experience in the electrification and in some cases the mini grid sector, the most recent one being Africa, which was just this month. So I wouldn't say they've been wary per se. I think at the end of the day, pragmatism has prevailed. You know, so we're continuing to grow, and I think that as I said in the beginning of this webinar, I think these regulations move forward significantly to reinforcing that confidence, and of course my hope is that that'll continue to crowd in investment from outside of the country and potentially even from inside, because that's something we haven't yet addressed, is getting, you know, Kenyan investors to look into the sector and investing in the sector within their own country.
Super. Thanks, Viv. Okay, great. I do have 1 or 2 more questions for the panelists, but I just, as we're going to very shortly move to the audience participation, where we'll field questions from all of you audience members, I want to remind you about the question portal. You should be able to submit a question in the Q&A portal. You can direct it generally, or you can direct it to an individual panelist as you see fit. And please, in your questions, mention your name if your name isn't clear from your participation, and also mention the organization that you represent, if you don't mind, so we know where the questions are coming from. And we might answer some of the questions there in the Q&A panel, so you see some of them answered with a typed answer, and others will pose here to the panelists. So I want to ask maybe one more question well, maybe, okay, I do have a few more. Maybe one more for yourself, Yeva, if you don't mind. Will REPP continue to invest in Kenya's mini-grid sector with these regulations in place?
I would say that the answer is, well, it would be two words, would be yes, unless. So the yes is that, of course, it's encouraging to see, you know, how the regulatory framework has been improving. I think, as I said, there are certain gaps that you know, we've touched upon. I think the planning as well will be very followed very closely, and the capacity of counties to actually you know, to actually submit their planning that will be integrated into the INEP, the Integrated National Electrification Plan. So we're looking closely to see when that will be developed. That will also give us an idea of what the, you know, what the full government's vision is for electrification, and what role is envisaged for the private and public mini grids. So we're looking closely, and of course, you know, REPP is open for business. We are always looking for new companies and projects that require our support. The second word, which was unless, is referring to the fact that a key criteria for REPP is being additional. And so we hope that, you know, already over the last few years, by having financed Power Hive and then subsequently a PowerGen, and now with the support that we have also been, or advice that we have been trying to provide in for the development of the enabling environment, including the conversation we're having today, we hope that many more funders, in fact, and different types of funders, so Vivian mentioned the importance of Kenyan investors, but also we know, and we have some, I think several colleagues from various DFIs on the call today that are also looking closely at the sector. So REPP is here to pull in others to join us. So the unless part is that, you know, if others are here and we're no longer required, then we'll happily step away to let the market grow.
Thanks, Yeva. All right, and let me steal time for one last question from my side, and then we've been getting some great questions from audience members, and we'll start to field those. This is a question for Viv. Viv, what, as a developer, are your views on the critical pieces of the regulations? Two main ones that I'm thinking about are the tariff calculation and the licensing approval processes. Do you have confidence that these will enable Kudura Power to build a strong commercial case for your scale up?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I think the critical thing here in terms of tariff calculation and ultimately approval is that obviously, you know, as a relatively small sector, we are reliant on CapEx subsidies to buy down the cost of energy. So as long as we can continue to raise CapEx subsidies like we recently did from the Green Minigrid Facility Kenya, supported by AFD and the European Union Africa Infrastructure Trust Fund, I think that the market will continue to grow. Tied to that, of course, is that the market needs to continue to accept cost-reflective tariffs as opposed to tariff equity, which or grid equity, which would ultimately result in a requirement for larger subsidies to get down there. I think, you know, we don't have any issues with the process and documentation. It's quite comprehensive, but it is time consuming. And I would say that the one big concern that we as developers have, particularly when we're chasing investment from private sector, I mentioned we'd lost an investor end of 19. You know, part of that was just timing. If we're not able to demonstrate that we can expect the national entities response within a reasonable period for, you know, tariff approval or, you know, a query that needs to be responded, then ultimately that drags out quite a bit. And that ultimately doesn't, you know, that doesn't be with anybody, because at the end of the day, if an investor is waiting for you for that period of time to get that license approved, and there isn't clarity on when that is actually going to happen, then that doesn't in any way reinforce investor confidence. So I think those are issues we're currently having, timely processing. I think with the new regulation, which kind of tightens up a lot more of what you can expect to happen over what timeline when you submit an application, we're hoping that would normalize, and then ultimately when the regulation gets approved by Parliament, that kind of last step of being able to demonstrate to the investors that they're operating in an environment in which all of the stakeholders have mutual interest in moving things forward at a reasonable pace, I think is then guaranteed.
Super. Thank you, Viv. Great. Thank you all. Those were the questions from my end, and now we've been getting some fantastic questions from attendees. So we really appreciate everyone's participation in this. And I will not sugarcoat it. I'm going to tell you, Nixon, these are mostly directed at you. So you're probably in the hot seat here. I think we're going to have to maybe Yeva and Viv can take some of the pressure off and answer a few of these. But let me start with a couple questions that we've just seen that are really great questions, and it would be great to hear Nixon, your response to. The first one is, could you please detail the protections in the regulation against unilateral tariff changes that would negatively impact the economics of the projects?
Thank you. I think I'll look at that aspect in three key areas. One is who initiates a tariff review, and number two is the process of the tariff review, and whether the control period has been provided for in the regulation or in the parent law. So in this case, from practice and what we have documented in the draft regulation that we have at the moment, the regulator doesn't initiate the process of tariff review, but the developer does initiate, because they're the ones who develop the project. So in this case, once a developer initiates that process, we will go through what we usually call stakeholder engagement, where we will look at, apart from looking at the model and the parameters, the technical aspects that have been put into the model, then we have to engage with the local community or the people who are going to be served with electricity. And this happens, be it for mini grids or even for the national tariff applied usually by the distribution licensee or the off-taker, who is Kenya Power in Kenya for that matter. So we have to go and talk to the community, and you can't talk to the community in the absence of the developer, because it's the developer who then does provide the service. And then in the parent law, that is the Energy Act of 2019, and what we have adopted in the current regulations, we are proposing a tariff control period of 3 years, because then that gives us some form of certainty in terms of how long it will take to review the tariff. And then, of course, then curtail that in terms of how long the regulator will take to review that tariff. And the principles of tariff review have also been stated in the regulations, and also are provided for in the Energy Act, where we are looking at the viability of the project, because then we can't just change the tariff. There has to be a basis. If a developer, for example, comes in and says, I've gotten a grant and I think I'm able to reduce my tariff, then that will be a reason why we can review that tariff. But for as long as that has not happened, then we'd assume that the tariff that has been approved will be able to sustain the project, and also definitely give the developer a reasonable rate of return. And that's why maybe for the participant, we have also shared the tariff structure, the tariff model that provides the structure of the key areas that we'll be looking at when reviewing the tariffs, which is also important to give that certainty in terms of how we are going to look at those applications when they come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Nixon. Very clear. And I hope that's answered the question from that audience member. Another question that I think is really critical and important, and also touches on one of our poll questions. So I actually wanted to point out the poll should be visible to attendees. If it's not, it will be shortly, and you'll see the poll on your screen, and please vote yes or no on the poll questions. We're going to tally all of these responses at the very end, so you should be able to change your responses throughout the rest of the questions, the rest of the roundtable here. So if you feel like you need to adjust, you can go ahead and adjust, and please respond to those poll questions. Viv, I see your...
I just wanted to protest because apparently a panelist cannot vote.
Panelists get observer power, but no, don't get votes on this one. We have to take the pulse of the audience. Sorry, Viv.
Fair enough.
All right. Super. So this is a question that does touch on one of the poll questions. I wanted to raise it and get a response from yourself, Nixon, and this might also be something, Viv, that you can speak to. This is a question from one of our great colleagues in Tanzania. He mentions that Kenya does not have a national tariff. So what is the risk of politics influencing conversations around tariff equity for grid-connected, main grid-connected customers versus mini-grid customers?
Yeah, definitely the tariff is a political issue, I think, in almost all countries globally. But what we have tried to do, or what we do at the moment to try and manage the politics, is to have a very clear public participation process. And I know Vivian must have participated in quite of some of the processes that we have had for tariff engagement, where we're even able to bring the local leaders on board. The county government has participated in those public participations, the local ward representatives, so that they understand the reasons why the developer is proposing a tariff that is beyond what is charged by the national utility. And in cases where we feel the national government or the county government is not comfortable, we have always requested them, because they also have a mandate in terms of electricity reticulation, to facilitate the developer to reduce the tariff, maybe by giving in some grant for capital investment, and in effect be able to reduce the tariff. And I know Ministry of Energy has been actively involved in discussing with the development partners to get some of the financing to be able to facilitate the reduction in the tariff for some of the mini grids that are being developed around the country. But then what I would also say from my perspective, I think we should be able to look at mini grids as a form of assisting people to realize their dream of having access to electricity. And we cannot hold investment for infinity by saying we should have a uniform tariff for the country, because we are still disadvantaging those local communities, given that they are using alternatives that could be even more expensive. For example, kerosene, which is more expensive if you quantify the amount that you spend maybe in a given month, and also expensive in terms of health. So these are some of the things that we clearly try to bring out on the table to stakeholders, and definitely encourage the government players, the Ministry of Energy, the county governments also to come in where possible and support investors to reduce the tariffs where it's possible. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Nixon. That's very clear. Viv, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's two things to consider with tariffs. Tariffs on their own are one thing, but of course there's the cost of connection. And that is critical, right? So in our business model, we effectively buy down the cost of connection to as little as $30, which includes not only connecting to the meter, the provision of the meter, but effectively wiring within the house for safety and earthing and everything else, and putting lights and plugs in the houses using any energy efficient light bulbs. If a rural consumer in Busia were to do that themselves, they would be easily paying 5 to 7 times that, just for the installation work. Never mind the connection fee, that if they qualified for the last mile connectivity program would be brought down, but still they would end up paying probably 10, 12 times what we charge for connection fee as an all-in-one. So that's the first thing, which is really important. That is the reason why we have so many households in existing communities that are effectively electrified, that are not connected to power, because they cannot afford that connection fee. And the second thing then, of course, is the actual cost of electricity on a kilowatt hour basis versus KPLC. Yes, KPLC does cost less, typically, around two to 2.5 times cheaper. But at the end of the day, our customers that are using our services in terms of Net Promoter Score and the surveys that we run regularly love the service, because it's fundamentally life-changing to have a light that you can switch on at night. And as Nixon pointed out, not rely on kerosene to light your house, not rely on having to take your telephone 5 or 6 or 7 kilometers away to the local community, the local commercial center that has power, and pay that to charge there. Overall, if you consider all of those on, effectively on a kilowatt hour basis, despite the fact that we charge more than KPLC, the customers are happy and they are spending less than they were spending previously. That I'm absolutely convinced of.
That's great. Okay, thank you, Viv. Nixon, allow me to keep you in the hot seat. We have a lot of great questions coming in. I want to just let everybody know we won't be able now, with the volume of questions we've received, to answer them all here on the webinar. We will try to answer some of them in writing here as we wrap up the webinar, and we'll also answer more in writing as a follow-up to the webinar, which we'll publish for all of you attendees. So just so you know, so please do keep submitting your questions. We're just picking a few, but we will get back to you in writing with responses to the questions that don't go answered here. Nixon, another question for you, which is, at present, what is the average time to obtain the permit to build a mini grid in Kenya? Let me modify that slightly perhaps and ask you, what's the difference between the current situation and what it will be under the new draft regulations? How does that work, and how long do things take in the current framework, and how does it work, and how long will things take in the new framework?
I'm sure Vivian will have very strong comments on this. But basically, for what we have had previously, for the initial process, for sure it has been a challenge in terms of getting responses from at times county governments, from Ministry of Energy, in terms of whether they have any objection to the project being developed. At EPRA, at times we admittedly we have gone beyond maybe 60 days as required. And that's why, as I mentioned in the initial remarks, we need these regulations to enforce order, because basically we are looking at it from two perspectives: give clarity to the investor, and at the same time give a push for the government representatives to be able to do their processes within a given timeline, and therefore be able to support business. So previously, I would say it has taken a bit of time. I may not be able to speak for the other agencies who are not EPRA, because I've not been able to interact with them in terms of how long they have taken to process some of the expression of interest or given letter of no objection. But I know in the new regulation, what you've been able to propose is at the Ministry of, at the county government. In the current draft, we don't have a timeline, but out of the public participation process that we have gone through, it has been proposed that we'll have 21 days. So maybe in the final draft, you'll see some timeline tied to the county government, because that's what came out of the public participation process that we have had. And that's why we had the process, so that the people could speak for themselves how they think we should be able to improve on the regulatory instrument. For the national government, that is the Ministry of Energy, we have proposed a period of 21 days. So 21 calendar days, which is 15 working days relatively. So that also does limit the time they will take. Then for the regulator, for the tariff approval, because it involves public participation, we have given a period of up to 60 days and 60 days for processing the license. So that gives an idea of how long it will take. And to be able to facilitate this process, thanks to GMG and AFD, we got some support. We have been working on an online platform that will bring all these processes into a system, so that people are able to process some of these applications online, starting from the expression of interest at the ministry, where the ministry is able to liaise with the various agencies through the system without necessarily relying on the traditional way of writing to a government agency to give comments on an application, but being able to approve these applications online and therefore facilitate the process. So I'm confident, from where I sit myself, I'm confident that once we have the new regulation in place, the time that has been taken to process some of these applications will greatly be reduced, because we have specified them in law. And then that law provides a social contract between the government agencies and the people on how long they should be able to process those requests. Thank you.
Thank you, Nixon. That's great. Another one for you, Nixon. And this one is a bit more of a, oh, I'm sorry, Viv, did you have a response on that? Were you off mute there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Nixon was saying. I think the critical thing here is that the new regulation is looking to really get all of the public stakeholders around the same table. It's important that the county is aligned and understands what's happening. It took us a long time to gain the confidence of the county that we were in this, in this thing seriously. And it requires that KPLC understand what's going on within the context of INEP, as Yeva said. It requires that the Ministry of Energy understands what they're dealing with from the point of view of an objection, and then in some cases rhetoric as well. And that's really the critical thing, is that all of these parties are closely aligned with EPRA's agenda at the end of the day, because without that, EPRA is not able to meet reasonable timelines in terms of getting these approvals. And so I'm certainly, it's one of the things that I'm really keen on, having had the experience that we have had over the last 3 years, just the tediousness of getting these licenses and tariffs approved, that this will go a long way to speeding that thing up, and ultimately I think is going to be good for investors. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Viv. I think this is an important question, this next one, and it is a bit more of a policy question, but I'm hoping, Nixon, you could potentially comment on this. So the question is, could you provide a little bit of framing information about the ownership model, Kenya Power, private, or split between those, that Kenya is pursuing moving forward?
So I think at the moment, most of the mini grids are private. Just to start with, I know there are bigger mini grids that are owned by government, basically government of Kenya owning the mini grids, then operated by KPLC. So those sites mostly are basically owned by government and being operated by KPLC on behalf of the government. Going forward, I think there's some work we did in 2017 where we estimated that we could have up to 500 mini grids in the country, new mini grids, to be able to realize the universal access target. The government has taken up, with support from World Bank, 152 mini grids, which are being developed under the Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access projects. So in my projection, I think there will be more than 300 mini grids that can still be developed by private sector. And maybe there could be more mini grids that are even connected to the main grid. So in this case, I'm giving estimations in terms of those ones that are isolated from the main grid. And to me, I don't see any problem. I know the challenge would be the challenge would be the tariff in some of the cases. And that's one of the discussions that I think we as stakeholders will continually have between ourselves, between us and government, to see how do we make these mini grids more affordable, be it private, be it government owned, so that we're able to support the rural communities in accessing electricity. Thank you.
Thank you, Nixon. Great. One more question, Nixon, again for you, and I hope you don't mind, but I think this is a great opportunity for folks from the Kenyan and international investor community who are our attendees here to work directly with you and hear your input on their questions. So I think everyone in the audience will appreciate that. The question is, what is required by the government or EPRA to ensure that land is rightfully owned and will not have a problem later once the mini grids are developed?
Sorry, Tom, kindly repeat the question.
Sorry, the question is, what is required by EPRA in the application process for a license to ensure that land is rightfully owned by the mini grid developer, so there will be no land disputes later?
Okay, I think initially we were requiring that the developer gives us a registered lease. So in this case, the registered lease will be applicable for cases where the land has been adjudicated and there's someone owning the land actually, or a title deed. So in this case, the investor will go negotiate for a piece of land and buy a land to be able to develop the project. But we then realized that there are places in the country where land is communally owned, or it could be a challenge actually to obtain a title deed because of succession issues. So we also had to assess the risk. And I know Vivian has developed containerized solutions, for instance, where you can easily move the generation infrastructure from one neighborhood to another neighborhood in case the conflict escalates. So then we saw it to be a smaller risk or a lesser risk than then insisting on someone having that registered lease, which could take years and years to obtain from maybe the Ministry of Lands and the county governments. So from where I sit or from where we sit as the authority, we are comfortable that provided the community has sufficient support from the local community and there is some form of transaction where the investor has made steps to pay for the land or maybe have an agreement with the landowner. And some of these agreements, if it's community land, then are endorsed by the county government, then that gives us sufficient comfort that there won't be any conflict in future. And where there is conflict, it's possible to mitigate that because then the infrastructure is not very huge that you can't move it to another location. Thank you.
Thank you, Nixon. That's great. All right, we're coming towards the end of the roundtable today, so I want to remind everybody to please vote on the poll answers. I have one more question fielded from an audience member for Viv, and we'll close with this, and then we'll just study the poll results in 2 minutes. So please, everybody, lodge your poll responses immediately, and we'll be able to study that at the end. So one question to wrap up here for you, Viv. It is often said that rural communities have little demand for power and therefore mini grids are not profitable. What is your experience?
That is a great question. That's $1 million one. Yeah, I mean, I think the reality, and we've seen in the press recently that in fact, there has been a lot of study being done into money that has been put into grid extension projects in rural areas, where if you leave the customers alone to do their own thing as you would do in a city or with a business customer, that demand does not grow. Our experience has been with the sites that we commissioned end of 2019, which have been operating now for 1.5 years. Our experience has been that we have consistent energy growth demand across households of around 9% over the period, which is roughly twice what we forecast in our financial plan. We're seeing business demand increasing around 60%, which is 3 times what we forecast in the business plan. And we've surprisingly seen public demand, so schools and that kind of thing, early childhood development centers, increasing around 20%. So right now, if I look at the business model that we put together 2 years ago on the basis of these 10 new relatively large sites that we built in Kenya, that is not our experience. And the reason that is because we have a team of people as part of our customer experience organization that are entirely focused on identifying demand. And that means identifying businesses that can use power to generate income. And the theory there, rather selfishly, is when you empower a household with more disposable income, they will ultimately spend more electricity, whether that's through buying a fridge or a freezer or setting up a business, whatever the case may be. And then the flip side of that is, in the case of households, is looking at finding ways to reduce consumption so that the money that they do spend is more effectively used. And so that involves very often appliance finance, looking at energy efficient appliances. We have, surprisingly a huge demand for entertainment as kind of a subsect of that business, where people are wanting televisions and radios and that kind of thing. And again, because our focus is this kind of social impact and 100% community, 100% coverage of the community, we don't differentiate the customer based on the income levels. We merely limit how much we are prepared to invest in that customer as a potential, investment risk on its own. So yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, as I say, we are ahead on most of our metrics in that regard. And I think it's entirely due to the fact that we are using grant funding to subsidize where possible the cost of appliances to make them more affordable for everybody in the community. But at the same time, a strong focus on this notion of financing end-use applications, whether for business or household pleasure, whatever the case may be.
Thank you, Viv. Thank you, Viv. Super. Everyone, we're at the end of the scheduled time for the roundtable today. So I want to end by first of all thanking our panelists, and we really appreciate all of your participation in the discussion today. So thank you, Viv, thank you, Yeva, and thank you, Nixon. This was a great discussion. We hope it was informative for all of the attendees, and we hope it was fun for yourselves to participate. And we maybe can take a minute briefly before wrapping up to look at the poll results. I think you should all be able to see the concluded poll results on your screens. Thank you everyone for participating. We got 45 responses in the poll. That's fantastic. Just to recap those results, do you believe that the regulations capture your position and takes into account the positions of the private sector? We have 40% yes, 20% no, and 40% not sure. Very good. Do you think that Kenya will have a politically stable framework to support the regulations, especially with the 2022 being an election year? We have 47% yes, 18% no, and 36% not sure. Okay. And are the new regulations bankable for mini-grid developers, and do they allow for scalable project finance? We have 31% yes, 20% no, and 51% not sure. So we have yes by a slim margin, but a lot of people not sure. I think we have maybe more education work to do with the stakeholders and attendees on this call, maybe with the broader investor community. We'll get to work on that. And let me wrap up on that note. And again, thanks everyone for participating.
Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.